45-minute lecture or so, plus a meditation at the end. And so expect, content, and I'm going to frame a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in the context of the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and Yoga Sutra 2.1 in particular. And then we'll do a brief meditation practice, and it's something that I think is particularly useful and rich and relevant for right now. And then we'll do the question and answer portion. So, last time I did the Sunday services, it was 5 strategies for sanity during this time. And one of the strategies for sanity was managing fear and going from fear to focus. And the way I do this is when I feel any type of fear, and it's usually like the first kind of wave of fear is usually some kind of big amorphous thing, and it usually tends to kind of take my mind to the worst case scenario, and if I kind of stuff it or try to keep it in a dark corner or deny it, disown it, disengage with it, it usually just kind of lingers and grows, and it ends up being like this haunting, amorphous shadow of fear. However, if I kind of turn towards it, it's kind of like a kid being scared of a monster underneath the bed. That if you don't address it, they just get more and more freaked out. But as soon as you're like, well, let's check, and like, what do you think they look like? Like, let's actually explore what this monster thing is. Similarly, if you turn around and look at the fear, often you're able to identify what it is and then address it. So curiosity is always one of our best strategies for starting to pivot out of fear and anxiety. And so when I started looking at the big amorphous fears that were coming up for me and kind of distracted my mind from running down that worst case scenario rabbit hole, part of what I would do is like, okay, what is it? What am I afraid of? And then also like, have I endured something like this before? Or have I been challenged in this way under other circumstances in my life? And when I started kind of addressing those big amorphous fears, getting curious about them, asking strategic questions about them, I realized that a lot of the resilience I have was built during particularly challenging and difficult times. And that all of those times had their own skill set that I developed to deal and to grow from the difficulty. And they brought about spiritual evolution for me. And when I started like getting curious about the fear, looking into it, then I actually became really grateful for some of these challenging times, and also could kind of start to lean into those skills. I'm like, okay, this really worked at this time in my life, and this really worked during this other episode. And I call these episodes the dreaded D's, because I was kind of looking at them about a year ago, and I was like, all of these bad things start with D, right? And for me, these episodes are depression, which was what got me involved in the practice initially, disease, and subsequent death of a loved one. And that loved one was my little fur baby, Leela. And I come from like a family that like totally treats dogs like people, to the dismay of many other humans. And some people are like, it's just a dog. But like for me, it was definitely not a dog in a lot of ways. And so it was super kind of special relationship. And those of you who have animals and relate to your animals in that way, that they kind of take a special place in your heart. And when they leave you, it's very intense. So, and then the last one was, in this past year, I went through a divorce, and that was a particularly interesting challenging time because I had so much practice underneath my belt. So in a way, I was much more courageous with my practices during that time and my ability to really dive into feeling and being with all the really tough stuff. And it was both an exhausting and exhilarating time. And during that time, I got much more acquainted with grief. I would say, like, the death of Leela was, I really couldn't go as far into the grief then because it was too painful. But with the divorce, there was this much more kind of a flavor of grief, and I think that's very similar to what a lot of people are experiencing now. There's almost this grieving process that we're starting to go through with the change in life and the change in circumstances, and even like our vision of life and who we are and what humanity is. And I think that kind of shade of grief will actually kind of become more pronounced as we travel this road with coronavirus. So I will be taking you through kind of each of those episodes and some of the practices I did. And when I was preparing this and examining these more fully, I realized that they fit beautifully with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, in particular Sutra 2.1. So for those of you who are less familiar with the Yoga Sutras, it's a collection of aphorisms, kind of short, pithy phrases that are meant to be unpacked and explored. And you have monks and scholars who spend their whole lives exploring and examining just like one Yoga Sutra because they're just so dense. And this collection of aphorisms we can place it, around like 200 BC to 200 Common Era. Sometime around there, there's a lot of scholarly and historical debate about when they were put together, who put them together, if the fourth chapter even was written by the same author. And then there's another kind of concern about, was it written for monks, renunciates and ascetics, or for householders? And I mention that because I feel like in modern yoga, the Yoga Sutras have been taken to be almost like Bible status, like the book of yoga. And they're one of many books of yoga. They've become particularly important in modern postural yoga just because of the emphasis placed on them. But they exist within a certain historical context, and they have some gems. And there's lots of other references and resources for the modern yogi that sometimes are much more appropriate. For example, in the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras, it's called Samadhi Pada, and it's about the practices and the things to do when you are graced and born with a steady, still mind. So it's this very high level perspective in the beginning of the Yoga Sutras. And then towards the end of the first chapter, he basically says, and if you don't have a steady, still mind, if your mind tends to be easily distracted and disturbed, then this isn't really appropriate for you, but don't worry, we have chapter 2. And most of us don't begin life or begin yoga with a steady, still, calm, clear mind. It's much more of a turbulent, whirlpool-ridden, journey. So chapter 2 says, if you don't have a steady, calm, still mind, this is the practice for you. And it's called Sadhana Pada, and it's the chapter about practice and about action steps and things to do on a regular basis so that you get to that place of more of a calm, steady mind. And the first sutra in the second chapter says, Tapas, Svadhyaya, Ishvar Pranidhana, Kriya Yogaha. Tapas, Svadhyaya, Ishvara Pranidhana, Kriya Yogaha. And it basically reads like a recipe for yoga. Kriya comes from the same root as karma. It's about action. And Kriya is more kind of like spontaneous action or things that are spontaneously arising. Yoga, yoking, connecting, joining together, a state of unification. And Patanjali will put special emphasis on yoga being a state of a calm, clear mind. So in order to have a spontaneously arising state of yoga, a more consistent, calm, clear mind, you need to do 3 things. The first one, tapas, it is often translated to austerities. We can more easily translate it to discipline. And it's the disciplines and the actions that you take to clarify your mind, create a light body. I don't like the word purity for Westerners, but to create like a healthy, light, vital body, and also to have emotional dexterity. And tapas is always also related to heat. So it's about cooking, it's about friction, it's about fire. And fire is the element that transforms. And a lot of what we have to do to practice and to make change in our lives requires discipline and friction and getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'll come back to that in just a moment and give you some kind of personal examples, but I'm going to go on with the overview of Sutra 2.1. The next ingredient is svadhyaya, and svadhyaya can be translated to self-study, self-inquiry, study of sacred texts. One of my teachers gave the most useful definition that I've ever heard, and he says that svadhyaya is taking the teachings into oneself. So it's asking for a inner inquiry, a personalization of practice, and also having the independence and autonomy to examine what these practices mean for you. Svadhyaya has a lot to do with creating mental clarity because you're able to kind of adjust the stories and the narratives you have about yourself. See through any voices that are in your head that aren't yours and make better decisions about who you are and how you want to live your life. Now, the third ingredient, Ishvara Pranidhana. Ishvara is a really useful word in Sanskrit. It's basically like a generic term for God or consciousness or energy, source, creation, whatever you best identify with to relate to kind of a all-encompassing power of the universe. Ishvara is basically like fill in the blank for that. And I know when I first started yoga, I had a really hard time with the word God. And so, at that time, like consciousness made a lot more sense. And that allowed me to kind of embrace some of these teachings. And for other people, that is source, its essence, nature, ground of being, whatever works for you. Ishvara is saying, put that here. Pranidhana means like bowing or surrender. And it's not, one of the things we have a hard time with in the West is surrender because we see it as something passive, something that's weak, something that's like a laying down and giving up. Whereas the tradition sees surrender as something very powerful. It's being able to relinquish the like death grip of control that just takes a lot of energy and doesn't actually ever work, and being able to trust or lean back into this bigger field of energy and unfolding. And I think we are getting a really powerful lesson in surrender right now, because you can have your death grip on control, right? And I definitely find myself washing my hands absurd amounts of time during the day, and also like getting super neurotic, because this is why I have to do yoga every day, with like as soon as I wash my hands, I'm like, I don't know if I did it good enough, and then washing them again. And at the same time, then having to say, like, I have no control over what's going on. I don't know how this is going to play out. Yes, I can take intelligent action to do the best I can during this time. And there's a relaxation into the not knowing that's actually very powerful and creates a sense of inner peace, even if you have neurotic tendencies. So that is the recipe for spontaneously arising states of yoga. And I'm going to take you through how these played out in episodes within my own life. So the first one, the dreaded D's, is depression. And for me, it's so interesting to reflect on this. And I had this dinner with a girlfriend a while back, and she got me talking about this and all the details. And I was like, I cannot believe I'm telling you this. She's like, you have to talk about this more. She's like, this is amazing. I'm like, these are like tales from the crypt. Like, we're like digging up the bones and the carcass of my former being and letting it dance around. So I kind of joke around that these are the tales from the crypt, and I can make them funny. They're also a little scary. And it really feels like it happened to someone else. And it's a big part of my story because this is what got me practicing. So I started, I can distinctly remember having experiences of depression when I was about 10. And then by the time I was a teenager, I was in therapy, and it wasn't really what I was looking for in terms of like help. But I was also at that time during my teenage years playing a lot of sports. So I played a lot of sports like year round. I had 1 weekend off a year from soccer. I was involved in like student leadership, that type of stuff. So I was busy, and busy was important. And that also has a lot to do with tapas, and I'll get to that in a moment. But then I went to college, and the first year of college was okay, but then I got a little bit bored, and I wasn't playing sports. I didn't really get involved in student leadership because there was all this bureaucracy involved, and I was used to being in a small town and kind of a big fish in a small pond, and then all of a sudden I'm like a tiny fish in an enormous pond, and this was in Chicago. And I started to have an existential crisis. So around 2002, 2003, it started to get dark. And then at 2004, it kind of reached its crescendo to the degree I was hospitalized and really just kind of felt like I was at the bottom of a deep, dark well, and I had no idea how to get out. But by, 2005, I was really dedicated to like climbing out. And I had this mental image of like literally being in some deep, dark place and having to like scramble out. And I'd have to like take breaks, where something would be working and then it wouldn't, and not really knowing even how to get out. But I identified the fact that the only place I felt really good was after a yoga class. And this was interesting because I had normally shied away from anything I wasn't good at, and I was terrible at yoga by all physical standards, right? I could not touch my toes. I would shake the whole time, right? Just like quivering. And my eyes would water because the stretching was so intense. I also was not my healthiest self at that time, as you can imagine. So I was skinny, and I probably smelled like cigarettes and alcohol the whole time too. So it was like all around not pretty. However, I kept going because at the end of class was the only time I felt any type of release and tranquility. And because I have a sports background, I got really strategic. I was like, okay, I feel normal for about 4 hours after a yoga practice. So if I do it 2 times a day, then I'll feel normal for about 8 hours. So that led to a lot of practice and practicing 2 times a day for, anywhere from like 3 to 4 hours a day for many years. And I never really expected physical benefits, just because I had a lot of stories that like yoga wasn't for a body like mine, but they definitely came over time, especially as the mental emotional stuff sorted itself out. This is really a good example of tapas, of the friction of discomfort. And part of what tapas does is it overcomes inertia. It overcomes the heaviness and the darkness. And so the discipline of practicing regularly helped me kind of literally crawl out of what I saw in my mind's eye as a dark hole. And so when you're feeling things like darkness, heaviness, inertia, can't get going, overwhelm, despair, tapas, some type of practice to help you build momentum and energy, is essential. Tapas also has a lot to do with the health routines you have, including things like diet and sleep. And during those years of treatment, I look back and I'm horrified that no one was asking me about my diet, because I was living on what I call the 3 C's: coffee, cigarettes, and champagne, right? I worked in the restaurants, so this was a very appropriate lifestyle, although hardly one we would call yogic. But, one of the things that happened as I started to practice and build more of a relationship with my body and started to overcome that heaviness and darkness of tamas was that I did start to want to eat better. I didn't want to go out drinking after work because I wanted to get up and practice yoga more. So that kind of practice and my relationship to practice, my devotion to practice, started creating ripples of change and transformation in the rest of my life, including like lifestyle choices, dietary choices, sleep choices, things like that. And that's only become more refined over the years. And it's also become refined to the degree that like I can suss out when indulging feels good and when it's just kind of numbing. When it's like a real treat that I can enjoy and when it's kind of destructive. Things like that, that get very refined. So tapas gives us that opportunity to build momentum, lightness, vitality in the body. It starts to clarify the mind, and also starts to bring some illumination to the mental emotional patterns. And kind of to wrap this up, in traditional Ayurveda, the posture practice would be prescribed for the psychosomatic benefits. The physical benefits were considered a byproduct, but it was for managing the mental emotional stuff. Another element of this that can go a long way in terms of tapas is small acts of self-care. And those small acts of self-care can also be momentum building and light creating. And as we go down this journey with shelter in place, coronavirus, and the repercussions and ripples that will occur after kind of the immediacy of our situation, I believe that people will often, especially if your like livelihood has been impacted by this, feel overwhelmed, depression, despair, despondency. What's the point? Why get out of bed? And when those things occur, remember that one of the best things to do is build momentum, build the heat, be willing to endure the friction that comes from just getting up and getting going. Now, the next major episode was the disease and death of my little fur baby Leela. And one of the reasons this was so traumatic for me was because when my dog passed away, she was 2.5. So she got really sick when she was kind of just coming out of her like puppy phase, right? She was 2 when she got sick. And she got an inflammatory brain disease, which was particularly horrific way to go. And part of what I really had to contend with was I had taken so many steps to ensure she'd had like the best quality of life. For example, this dog like never ate kibble. She only had like the super special raw dog food from the farmer's market. So I'd, again, applied certain actions to creating what I thought would be health and longevity for her. And so when she got sick, it really rattled my sense of control. And what was a sneaky subconscious belief that if you did everything right, bad things would not happen. And that's just not true. You can do everything right, and there are still challenging and difficult times, and there is the ultimate truth of death. And I also had to examine my beliefs around death because I was operating for a long time during her sickness with the belief that death was bad and needed to be prevented or avoided at all costs. And at a certain point in time, her quality of life was so poor that continuing to do medical interventions felt cruel. And I had to, argue with a neurologist about that insisted I give her more medication. And I'm like, no way. No way. So this episode was for me the big teaching on Ishvara Pranidhana, of surrendering to a bigger energy and surrendering to what is, and also embracing the fullness of creation. That it's, we spend a lot of time chasing what we like, what we're attached to, the things we classify as good and worthy, things like praise and gain, youth. And we spend a lot of time and energy running away from the things we classify as bad, like loss and blame and death. And part of what the union of yoga and part of what the practice wants us to cultivate is a capacity to experience and embrace it all. That does not mean that you like it, right? To say that everything is equal is a denial of certain emotions and experiences. It's a numbing of, aversion to a certain degree. You're like, okay, well, I don't want to feel those. I think I should not feel certain things, attachment or aversion. So I'm going to pretend like I don't feel the difference between them. I'm going to numb out, or put like kind of a film of spiritual bypassing in between me and these experiences and emotions. So with this ability to embrace it all, it's not that you prefer everything equally. It's that you're able to appreciate that life always has this pendulum swing, and that you're able to endure the highs as well as the lows. And one of my dear friends once said, you know, if you can imagine like a pendulum swinging, we always have that experience because we're embodied, we're in a human body, and we're in a realm of duality. So that's just the nature of this life, and we see it with the inhale and the exhale. We see it with male and female. We see it with sun and moon, day and night. So there's always going to be this pendulum swing of the pairs of opposites. But through the practice, it's like we're able to climb up that string and establish a point of awareness that's steady and still and can observe that swing. And that observational quality is interesting because it just gives you a little bit of a calm in the storm. If you think about like a tornado or a hurricane, any of those types of vortexes, there's always kind of like a calm, steady, still place in the center. And it's like the practices give us that when dealing with the whirling and the churning and the eternal pendulum swing of duality and pairs of opposites that are just part of this life. So during her disease, in which her body started to fail as it was dealing with the inflammatory reaction in her brain and her spinal cord, as well as the subsequent death from that, I was having to kind of really investigate my attachment and my aversion, and also witness and start to watch what was happening from a place of more calm and clarity. And that required a certain degree of like surrender into the process of what was happening, because I wanted to fight it tooth and nail, and I did for a while. And that was way worse than when I was like, okay, I can trust in this process of life. And I would do a meditation during that time where I would imagine myself like a little leaf in a big river of life, because there's nothing that to me humbles me more than realizing how small and insignificant I am in terms of the grand scheme of life on this planet. And humble not in a bad way, but in a way that's actually quite peaceful and gives a sense of connection and compassion. So when we do our meditation, I will guide you through that meditation of being a little leaf in the big river of life. Now, lastly, the last episode, and the most recent episode, was my divorce. And during this time, I was experiencing really intense and tumultuous emotions, and especially the grieving process of having to grieve a vision for my life and a hope and a belief I had and had devoted myself to wholeheartedly and fully, and really having that stripped away to the point that it was hard on my heart. And this intense emotional roller coaster, it was challenging to kind of navigate, because it was so up and down, and there was everything from like sadness to rage to anxiety and worry, and there was frustration and difficulty in communication, like everything. And so the practice that became my lifeline was that I would sit down to meditate in the morning and ask myself how I felt, like what was going on inside of me. And so this became a really deep practice of svadhyaya, of self-inquiry and self-exploration, and it led me to learn with much greater clarity how to self-soothe, and that feeling things, contrary to popular belief, doesn't increase them. It's like it allows them to pass through you, and it's like that poem by Rumi, The Guest House. It's like they're there to teach you, to alert you to something, to give you a greater awareness of yourself, and then they just pass through. And when you deny, downplay, disown, try to stuff them into a corner of the body, that's when they become more problematic. It's like instead of letting the guests come in and talk to you, it's like they all just start to build up outside of your house until they're an overwhelming mob banging on your door. And so I would sit down to meditate and really inquire about how I was feeling. And I also stopped giving the emotions names. So instead of classifying something as anxiety, which I have a lot of programming around and a lot of beliefs around and a lot of narratives around, I would be like, oh, I'm feeling that itchy, scratchy churning in my belly. Instead of labeling something as depression, I would be like, oh, I'm feeling really heavy and sad. So I started letting the emotions have their own unique flavor and tried to just feel whatever was up versus giving it a label and a story. And part of the way I would encourage myself to do that is I would journal after the meditations. Just what came up, what I was feeling, any metaphors or imagery that was attached to the feeling. And this became a great lesson in becoming intimate with my internal landscape. And the funny thing is too, like, this has given me such greater clarity and confidence and trust in myself and whatever I'm going through. Even like, for example, towards the end of the divorce, once it was final, I had to do a lot of changes to the business with like the logo and the website, and like Carl and I are twinsies with our Kanda Yoga School hoodies, right? And in the past, I've traditionally had difficulty making decisions because I'd fuss a lot about if it was right or if it was like, and then I would often consult 10 people who would always have different opinions, and then I would end up being more confused, right? There would be no consensus. So rather than do that, because of this inner inquiry I'd been doing for about a year, I was able to be like, this feels like the right thing. This feels like the right person to do the website or do this. This is the right logo. And maybe I'd consult people or maybe not, but I was much more clear on what I thought was right for me. And that's invaluable. Because the truth of the matter is, like, no one knows. And a lot of us have gotten messages that we can't trust ourselves. So there's a lot of self-doubt. And so it increased my muscle of self-belief. So through this, what I would encourage you to do is tease out some of your own life experiences that have led to great growth. And notice if they tend to follow this kind of theme of learning how to build momentum and strength within the body, mind, and spirit. If they have led to greater self-inquiry or stronger relationship to your intuition and inner wisdom. And also if they've taught you how to surrender, how to soften, how to be more in the state of flow. And all of these are signs that the practice is working. And during this time, we have incredible opportunity to apply this recipe for yoga, to have discipline and structure within our days, to do inner work while we're more isolated than we normally are, and also to surrender and open up to this unfolding of life and nature that we're seeing. So for just about 7-10 minutes or so, we are going to do a brief guided meditation. As a teacher, I don't do a lot of this, partially because meditation for me has always been such a personal experience. And I mention that because there's no right way to meditate. It's more of an opportunity to expand your inner awareness and your ability to connect with that witnessing consciousness. And for some people, just free-form meditation works really well. Relationship to the breath works really well. For me, mantra works really well, but visualizations come quite spontaneously when I just open up in meditation. So then it's something I use regularly. And with this meditation, like, get creative with it. Allow your imagination to free flow. That taps you into the layer of the mind that some of you have studied with me, buddhi, the discernment faculty, the higher intellect that is tied to imagination and intuition. So make your way into a comfortable seat. Close your eyes. And take some time to feel the currents of your breath. The sweet flow of inhale and exhale. It's like the breath is clearing out, washing out the mental chatter and drawing you deeper into your mind's eye and imagination. And then imagine yourself as a little leaf. And you're a little leaf that is in a big river of life. A river that is wide and deep. It has unimaginable currents that guide you and also sometimes lead you in twists and turns that you cannot foresee or control. And this great river of life has many tributaries, many different streams and sources. All building the energy and momentum and trajectory of life that is carrying you. And because the big river of life is so vast, so wild, instead of fighting it, instead of trying to apply your small, limited form to the great currents, instead you allow yourself to soften, to relax, to release, to be in repose and be carried by the magnificent force of the river. And because you have relaxed and released a little bit, you can actually participate in the journey. You can more fully enjoy when you hit a little eddy and it's like a lazy river. And you can even become a little bit tickled and excited and invigorating when the ride becomes wild, when there are dips and twists and turns. And enjoy the next few minutes breathing and feeling, observing yourself being carried by the currents of life. Slowly start to deepen your breath. Return to your body. Take a few more breaths to transition. You can start to open your eyes slowly. Imagine like blinds being opened, letting in the light of the world around you. You know, there was a short meditation, just kind of a taste. And if this type of visualization feels rich and useful to you, you know, it's something you can use to kind of get yourself to that place beyond the mind and the churning thoughts and into the creativity and spaciousness of a witnessing perspective. And with especially if meditation is new to you, resist the temptation to think that you need to do it right. There's no right. It's just time to connect and turn your awareness inside. And it's not that we get good at meditation. We just we go through the tapas of discipline and we practice, and that increases our relationship to that witnessing awareness. So it's a relationship that you build. And just like any relationship, it takes time and effort and connection. I'm going to take you all off mute and use the next few minutes for questions if you have any. Questions, comments, ahas? It's never good to ask for questions after a meditation. Everyone's like, I
really like changing the. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go for it.
I really liked the changing fear into focus and curiosity. It's like it's a way to slow down that catastrophizing that I do a lot in my head. So it's kind of like recognizing the fear before I start that spiral and focus it more, like being curious. Have I felt these emotions before? Like that was really, really good for me. I really liked that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's one we can all use right now because, you know, we're in a situation that there's like a bazillion things to fear. Like fear's a very reasonable and natural response. What's not reasonable is like going down the rabbit hole, but that takes tools and awareness. So I think that's really good to recognize and then have some strategies. Jane, did you have something?
Yeah. I just really liked the image of being on the river and just felt myself being carried along. And then I was just going with it. And this huge wave of grief and sadness just came up. And I let myself just ride that wave and let it just kind of move through me and continued and kept feeling myself being in the river and being carried along by that. And then it just, when you were talking about being in the eddy, sort of felt that wave subsiding, and then I just kept riding it until it was over. It was a really powerful experience, and I really liked it. And I didn't fight it like I usually do. So that was good.
That's a really, thank you so much for sharing. And that's a really good point, is that part of that self-inquiry, self-study for me is allowing myself to feel the emotions, because there is like that tendency to repress them. And I remember when I was starting the whole separation divorce process, my teacher was like, you have to feel everything. And I was like, I can't. I feel like if I feel everything, I'm going to start crying and I will never stop. And I said this, right? Like this, I'm not making this up. I was like, and I can't do that because I have things to do. And she goes, oh, so feeling would be inconvenient. And I was like, yes, very inconvenient. And there are those times when we have to kind of like keep it together. And so then it's extra important to have the times where you can go with it and you can feel it and you can have those emotional releases. And for me, those places to have those releases and to ride those waves and to let the emotions pass through you so they don't build up and become that mob outside of your door. For me, that place is meditation and journaling, right? And sometimes the mat too. Like when my pup was passing away, I would go to Ashtanga and I would cry half the time. I'd just be like weeping as I'm going through my practice. And that is appropriate, right? Don't, especially during this time, resist kind of clamping down on your emotional catharsis, right? If anything, like allow yourself more fully, maybe more freely than ever before to let those waves of emotion move through you. Any other questions, ahas, breakthroughs, or moments of revelation?
Just one thing with the, it's more of an intellectual thing, but when you were talking about surrender, and I think it was actually in a way sort of answered in the meditation, but because I think when you're talking about, God or other, and so that sort of has that dualistic nature, and then the non-dualistic, though, is like this, you can surrender, obviously, to the river and to the flow of energy, the flow. So I don't know, I was just toying back toggling between surrendering into something else, versus like it's all together. I don't know.
That's a really good point, because one of the things with like the non-dual tradition is that they will not differentiate between, they consider God and nature, so like consciousness and all the energy that creates the river of life as like two sides of the same coin. You can't separate them. But I think that it's good that you mentioned the intellectual thing, because I think that happens a lot for us as Westerners, because most of us grew up in whether it was like we went to church every day or we didn't, right? Because even if you didn't grow up in a religious family or a family that went to church, we grew up in a culture that has a Christian basis, where God is a dude in the sky who is outside of you. So then I think we almost always default intellectually to thinking that God is some guy in the sky to a certain degree. Whereas in the yoga tradition, consciousness awareness, which will sometimes be called Shiva, and that energy and mystery and power of life, which is often called Shakti, are just two sides of the same coin. And so things like the river can give us a sense of that energy and power of divinity. And then part of our kind of work is to bridge that intellectual gap that we have with it. And then I think that like, that's also interesting to examine in the fact that like we have become so disconnected with nature. So I think that form of God can be a more powerful leap for us, but also one that we don't automatically and instantaneously go to. Does that make sense?
Yes, very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good question. I like that. Okay, anything else, yogis, before we sign off? Well, thank you all so very much for being here. Thank you for exploring yoga more deeply and fully during this difficult time. And I'll be doing this every Sunday until I'm not doing it every Sunday. And whatever that means. And because this has actually been something that's been a great joy for me to prepare these and to keep my mind kind of focused on the yoga. When just like all of you, I have that tendency to like, you know, the kind of like death spiral of fear and disaster. So next Sunday, the kind of working title I have is Poised for Post-Traumatic Growth. And this idea of post-traumatic growth was something I came across. So when I was going through the divorce and kind of my Svadhyaya boot camp, I read like a bazillion books and was kind of like dedicated after I had my it's inconvenient to feel things moment, and then got committed to feeling things. I also got committed to, I would imagine, like wringing a dish towel. I was like, I'm going to wring as much learning and growth and strength out of this as I can. So that led to some pretty intense study and deep inner work. And one of the words I came across early on was post-traumatic growth. And I was like, what an awesome way to frame this. Yes. And so I will kind of put together a framework and a way for thinking about post-traumatic growth and some strategies around that. And that's what we'll do on the next Sunday services. So thank you all. I appreciate you. I treasure this time we have together. Mm-hmm. Namaste.
Namaste.
Mm-hmm.
Namaste. Bye.
Ciao.